From a 900-pound saltwater crocodile that forced through a corroded barrier and entered a public walkway full of visitors to a 3,200-pound hippopotamus that was already loose on zoo grounds by the time the gates opened in the morning. Today, we're looking at 7 escaped animals that fatally attacked visitors at zoos.
Hi, happy to have you here. We're starting in rural Oklahoma,
where a reptile enthusiast on a guided tour had no idea that the enclosure he was standing beside had been flagged for emergency repair 11 days before his arrival. It was June 18th, 2016, rural Oklahoma. The flatlands in June carry a flat, patient heat, nothing dramatic, just steady pressure from every direction. The air stays still. By midday, there is no shade worth finding. Jose Velez was 29, and he was the kind of person who knew just enough about a subject to feel completely comfortable around it. He had kept reptiles since his early teens. Nothing professionally, nothing that would place him in any formal category of handler or expert, but he had spent enough years around enough animals that he had stopped experiencing the baseline caution most people carry around large predators.
And personally, I think that's one of the most dangerous stages a person can reach around any animal. Fear can get you hurt, but familiarity can convince you nothing bad is going to happen at all.
He attended exotic animal expos across the southern United States the way other people attend trade shows or weekend parties, enthusiastically, regularly, and with the quiet confidence of someone who had been close to dangerous things before and walked away each time without incident. He had booked a visitor tour at a reptile zoo outside rural Oklahoma that offered guided walkthrough presentations of large captive reptiles. It was exactly the kind of destination he sought out. The zoo's primary exhibit was a 14-foot saltwater crocodile weighing just over 900 pounds. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptile species on Earth and among the most mechanically dangerous animals in captivity. Their bite force exceeds 3,700 pounds per square inches, the highest recorded of any living animal, and their attack mechanism is not a sustained hold but a rapid, explosive strike, followed by a rotational roll designed to disorient and disable prey within the first seconds of contact. They do not telegraph. They do not escalate. The transition from still to attacking is essentially instantaneous. The zoo had documented a problem with the crocodile's primary enclosure gate for weeks before Jose arrived at a drainage side barrier that had been weakened by soil erosion along its lower frame. The repair had been scheduled. The parts had been ordered.
I never find those details reassuring when I read investigation reports. A dangerous problem doesn't become less dangerous because someone filled out the paperwork to fix it later.
Nobody saw it coming because nobody was watching for it. The crocodile hadn't lunged. It hadn't thrashed. It had simply kept pressing short, patient intervals of lateral force against the lower frame. The kind of movement that doesn't look like escape until the moment it becomes exactly that. When the barrier gave, it gave all at once. No warning, no sound that anyone would have recognized as a sound worth running from. The crocodile entered the public walkway in a single motion. 8 visitors were standing in that corridor, positioned for the guided presentation, close enough to each other that there was nowhere obvious to move. Jose was among them. Nobody there was aware of this, but staff at the far end saw the barrier fail and started moving immediately without hesitation, just moving, as if they had sensed something in their minds. The distance between them and the visitors wasn't large.
On any other morning, it wouldn't have mattered at all, but that morning, it was the only thing that did.
Jose was closest to the enclosure side of the corridor. The animal covered the distance between the gate and his position in a movement that witnesses described as faster than they had expected and lower to the ground than anything that size should have been able to move. The attack was over before staff reached the corridor. Other visitors sustained injuries during the evacuation. Unfortunately, Jose did not survive the initial contact. Investigators found the zoo operating with a maintenance backlog across multiple enclosures. The drainage side barrier specifically noted in internal records as a priority repair 11 days before the incident. The parts that had been ordered had not yet arrived. The tour had not been suspended while the barrier remained unresolved. There was no protocol requiring it to be. Jose Velez had visited that zoo as a paying guest who understood reptiles well enough to be excited by proximity to a large one, and not well enough to know what an unsecured barrier beside a 900-pound saltwater crocodile actually meant. That gap between familiarity and knowledge, between comfort and safety, was where the morning sequence of failures found him. And like this, Jose took his last breath in a place he loved the most. Yes, he was aware of the danger he was in, yet he still chose to go. The next story is about someone who shared none of his background. A young woman who walked into a zoo as a visitor, followed every instruction she was given, and still never walked back out. It was August 9th, 2014, Southern Arizona. August in the high desert is a study in contradictions, dry heat that the monsoon season has not yet broken, afternoons that press down hard and then, without much warning, turn. The sky goes copper before a storm. The air shifts. Animals feel it before people do. Anita Holt was 17. That detail matters more than it might seem. She was competitive, disciplined, and had qualified for a regional track championship that summer. A person who understood the relationship between structure, preparation, and what you can achieve inside a system that is working properly. Honestly, this girl, she wasn't reckless. She wasn't defiant. She was a teenager on a summer road trip program who stopped at a small zoo and, by all accounts, simply followed every instruction she was given. The zoo housed 3 jaguars used for conservation education events near visitor grounds. Jaguars are the largest cat species in the Americas and possess the strongest bite force of any big cat in the Western Hemisphere, capable of piercing bone and crushing skulls. Unlike most large felids, they do not target the throat. They target the base of the skull. It is a strike pattern that produces death almost instantly and leaves very little window between initial contact and outcome. One of the 3 animals had been relocated to a smaller holding area during zoo renovations earlier that week. Staff had noted it had become measurably more agitated since the move. That information did not reach the people running the public demonstration that afternoon.
And I think that's the first detail that should make people uncomfortable. Animals don't need a reason that makes sense to us. If handlers are documenting behavioral changes, that information needs to follow the animal everywhere it goes.
The morning's decisions had each made sense in isolation. A handler secured a perimeter gate using only a temporary pin latch. The standard dual lock system was being replaced, and the pin was the interim solution. The choice to proceed with programming while the renovation was active made sense. So did the choice to position visitors near the observation deck while the animal was in a behavioral state its own handlers had already clocked as elevated. None of those individual choices seemed catastrophic on its own, but stacked together, all in the same afternoon, in the same space, they stripped away every layer of margin standing between the jaguar and an open corridor. The gate was forced. The animal moved into the space between the inner and outer fence lines. A second panel, also temporarily secured during the renovation, gave way under lateral pressure. Anita had separated briefly from her group and was jogging back toward the entrance along the outer path when the jaguar covered the distance between them. Witnesses reported almost no warning before the animal reached her. The sprint capacity of a jaguar over a short distance leaves no time for a person to react, regardless of where they're standing or how fast they can move. Emergency responders arrived quickly. It was already over by the time the first vehicle stopped. Federal inspectors arrived the following week and found what the investigation would describe as a pattern, not an incident. Multiple violations tied to temporary containment procedures during ongoing renovation. Duplicate safety systems being run sequentially rather than simultaneously. A decision environment in which renovation timelines and public programming had been allowed to overlap without clear protocols for which one took precedence when they conflicted. Anita Holt had done nothing that placed her in danger. She had separated briefly from a group at a zoo visit and was walking back along a path that was, on any other afternoon, fully secured. The danger that reached her had been constructed incrementally over several weeks of individually reasonable decisions made by adults who had no idea they were building toward the same moment. The zoo's permit was suspended. Its renovation was never completed.
What makes this case particularly hard to sit with is that Anita did everything right. She followed instructions, stayed with her group, and was simply walking back along a path that should have been secured.
The failure was entirely institutional, and a 17-year-old paid for it with her life. The next story is about a man who chose the destination himself on purpose, and with enthusiasm drawn to places that felt raw and unpolished, where nothing seemed out of place until it suddenly was. It was September 3rd, 2017, on the coast of Louisiana. September on the Gulf Coast carries the tail end of hurricane season, the air thick with moisture. The ground still soft from summer flooding that never fully drains. The zoos and swamp properties scattered along the inland coast have a particular stillness in the early morning. For Jacob White, an obscure zoo in coastal Louisiana was exactly the kind of stop that made the trip worth taking. He was 42, a substitute teacher from Arkansas, and the road trips were his thing. School breaks meant loading up the car with his 15-year-old son and driving toward places that didn't show up in travel guides, a little unusual. A little isolated, cheap admission, thin crowds. The zoo outside coastal Louisiana was exactly his kind of stop. Small, quiet, and run with the informal ease of a place that had never needed to present itself as anything more than what it was. The zoo housed confiscated exotic mammals. The largest animal on the property was a 3,200-pound male hippopotamus, imported years earlier from a foreign breeding program. Hippopotamuses are among the most dangerous large mammals on Earth, not because they hunt, but because their territorial responses are explosive and non-negotiable. A fully grown male can accelerate to over 20 miles per hour across short ground, with a bite force exceeding 2,000 psi sufficient to sever a small vessel in a single movement. Staff had noted the animal's elevated agitation in the days before Jacob's visit, tied to flooding that had disrupted its enclosure routine. Days of severe rain had worked steadily on a steel maintenance gate connected to the hippo's holding canal. Incremental structural damage that doesn't look critical at any single point until the load exceeds what remains of its rated capacity. The animal forced through during an overnight storm and positioned itself somewhere on the zoo grounds before dawn. When morning came, only 2 employees arrived. Storm damage had eliminated the rest of the scheduled crew, and no replacements had been called in. Radio communication between sections of the property was down. One of the 2 reported spotting what he believed was the hippo near the canal from across the grounds. With no way to cross-check, no radio, and an entire property to manage between 2 people, that distant, unverified sighting became the basis for the decision. No physical sweep. No delay to opening, no confirmation of any kind. Visitors, including Jacob and his son, were admitted on schedule.
And I have to say, I don't understand that decision. If you're not sure where a 3,200-pound hippo is, then the answer isn't to open the gates anyway.
The hippo entered the outdoor concession area mid-morning. Initial crashing sounds were attributed to storm debris still settling. It bought the animal seconds before anyone registered what was moving. Then wooden barriers and picnic tables gave way almost instantly as visitors scattered across the grounds. Jacob sustained severe injuries during the animal's movement through the space. Emergency responders arrived quickly.
But sadly, neither fact changed the outcome.
Investigators didn't have to work to find the failure point. It was documented in the zoo's own morning logs. A breach identified, a 2-person crew with no radio contact, a single unverified sighting treated as confirmation. Maintenance repairs flagged months before the flooding were still outstanding. The gate had been on the list. The decisions that cost him his life were made before he ever arrived in maintenance records, budget meetings, and a skeleton crew sent in without the tools to do the job safely. And that's how Jacob's last car trip with his son ended. The next story is about someone who also rejected the sanitized version. Not a visitor looking for authenticity, but a photographer who believed the only honest image was one taken without the safety of distance between her and the animal she was trying to capture. It was May 22nd, 2015, in western Pennsylvania. May in that part of the state is green and wet, the kind of green that comes from steady rain and wooded hillsides that hold moisture long after the sun returns. By evening, the air turns cool, carrying the smell of wet bark and pine. It's a good light for photography, but it's also the kind of evening where the canopy holds onto water, and when it finally releases it, it comes all at once. Nina Bailey was 31, a freelance wildlife photographer who had built her portfolio around captive exotic animals at independent zoos. She didn't want the photographs that already existed. She wanted the ones that weren't being taken. The quieter and more overlooked shots that required going somewhere smaller, less visible, more specific. She understood light and how to move within an enclosure without triggering a behavioral response. She preferred zoos that allowed proximity because she believed the images that came from that access were the only ones worth making. She had been granted approval for an evening photography session at a zoo on wooded property outside western Pennsylvania. The zoo housed several rescued African leopards, including a 140-pound adult male with a documented history of aggression toward handlers. Rain was forecast. The session was approved anyway. African leopards are the most adaptable of the large cats, and among the most dangerous, specifically because of how little they announce themselves. They climb. They position from above. They move through compressed spaces without detection. Unlike lions or tigers, which register in open ground, leopards reduce distance through elevation and patience, the kind of patience that looks like absence right up until it isn't. The adult male at this zoo had spent recent nights testing sections of the enclosure's upper mesh roofing. 2 locations had been compromised. The damage had been logged internally but not repaired, and it had not been reported to state regulators.
And once again, we run into a detail that appears over and over in these stories. Somebody knew about the problem before it became a disaster.
The rain arrived faster than forecast. Handlers were pulled toward moving feeding equipment across the exhibit, a redirect that focused their attention downward at the exact moment the threat was working from above. The added water weight on already compromised mesh caused a section of the upper roofing to collapse inward while handlers were mid-task and facing the wrong direction. When handlers discovered the collapsed section, they assessed the damage from the ground and concluded the animal had retreated into the service corridor within the enclosure's footprint still contained, just displaced. No lockdown was initiated. No visual confirmation was made. The leopard had already moved beyond the service corridor entirely into the elevated maintenance walkways running directly above the visitor path, and nobody on the ground knew it. Nina was photographing the feeding area near a staircase landing when the animal dropped from the overhead walkway into the corridor below. The distance from the walkway to the floor was short. The time between landing and contact was shorter. Staff could not reach her before it was over. The leopard was eventually contained in a locked storage section at the far end of the exhibit.
Sadly, Nina succumbed to her injuries before any investigation team arrived tomorrow morning in the area.
Authorities found the zoo operating without updated inspection approval. The mesh damage logged, unrepaired, and unreported was the central focus. But investigators noted something broader. The zoo had been operating outside the formal inspection cycle long enough that its internal records had become its only accountability system. Those records had flagged the problem, yet still allowed it to remain unresolved for weeks. And when the mesh finally gave way, the same informal culture that had allowed the damage to go unrepaired produced a ground assessment that was wrong and that nobody questioned before the session continued. One photograph takes everything. The next story is about a man who made the same trade without realizing it, who chose a zoo for the experience it promised, with no way of knowing that the gap between promise and reality would only become visible in the dark, in a storm, when the lights failed and nothing held. It was November 11th, 2018, in Central Texas. November in the hill country comes in cold and fast, temperatures dropping after dark in ways that catch people off guard, and a night sky so dark it makes you feel genuinely cut off from everything familiar. Storms build across the plains and arrive without much warning. On the night Trevor Boone drove out to the zoo, the weather had already turned before the forecasts said it would. Trevor Brown was 46 years old, an oil field mechanic from West Texas, who trusted his ability to read a situation and adjust. He preferred smaller zoos over large commercial destinations, off-grid experiences, the kind of nighttime safari a standard zoo wouldn't offer. He had booked a predator night tour at a small drive-through zoo for November 2018. The zoo's newest attraction was a 430-pound Siberian tiger hybrid, housed behind electrified fencing in a wooded enclosure. The animal had been recently acquired and was still establishing its behavior patterns in an unfamiliar space. Staff had already documented repeated generator failures causing intermittent outages along sections of the perimeter in the weeks preceding the tour. That information sat in internal logs. It did not affect the booking calendar. Siberian tiger hybrids are among the largest felids held in captivity, capable of dragging prey several times their own body weight through dense terrain. They are solitary ambush predators that become measurably more reactive during feeding periods, showing elevated alertness, a reduced threshold for movement stimuli, and an increased territorial response. The evening of Trevor's tour was a scheduled feeding night,
Which, to me, immediately raises the question of why visitors were there at all. If you know an animal is more reactive during feeding, why add more variables to the situation?
The variables assembled by the time he arrived a feeding period, an unstable electrical perimeter, a recently acquired animal in an unfamiliar enclosure, paying visitors moving through the property in the dark had each been documented separately. They had never been assessed together. The storms knocked out portions of the backup electrical system before the tour began. Staff attempted emergency repairs using portable battery units while the tour proceeded. The decision to continue rather than postpone was made without formal consultation. The Tiger moved through a section of perimeter fencing where current had dropped below the threshold needed to deter the animal. By the time the breach was identified, it had already entered the brush surrounding the safari trail. Trevor had stepped out of his vehicle to assist another guest with a jammed door when the Tiger emerged from between parked vehicles near the trail entrance. Visibility was near zero. Response teams could not establish the animal's position before contact was made.
Trevor died from his injuries before armed staff reached the scene.
Criminal negligence inquiries launched almost immediately. Investigators found that the generator failure pattern had been documented across multiple prior incidents and that no formal protocol existed for which activities should be suspended when perimeter power was compromised. The feeding schedule had not been adjusted despite the outage. The tour had not been paused despite the known behavioral elevation during feeding periods. The zoo lost its operating license. Trevor had chosen a smaller zoo, specifically because it offered something a large commercial park wouldn't. What it also offered, and what he had no way of knowing, was a gap between what its safety systems claimed to provide and what they could actually deliver when the weather turned and the lights went out. The next story requires almost no darkness at all. A spring afternoon, a small crowd, a volunteer fundraiser, and a single latch that one person forgot to check on the way through a gate. It was April 27th, 2013, Northern Florida. April, in that part of the state, is the last stretch of manageable weather before summer makes the outdoors genuinely difficult, warm without being brutal, the afternoons long and easy, the kind of day that makes outdoor fundraisers feel like a good idea. The zoo's spring event had drawn a modest crowd. Tents, folding tables, food vendors along the main walkway. The atmosphere was low-key and pleasant, the kind of small community event that nobody photographs because there doesn't seem to be anything worth capturing. Elena Ruiz was 18, a first-year community college student from Northern Florida, genuinely interested in veterinary work. She had attended several small wildlife fundraisers in the months before April 2013, informal, educational, low-key. She arrived at the spring fundraiser hosted by a small zoo without any particular concern. She was there to help set up, walk around, and support something she cared about. The zoo's main exhibit was a captive-bred southern cassowary, nearly 6 feet tall and approximately 130 pounds. Cassowaries are widely considered the most dangerous bird species in the world. The inner claw on each foot reaches up to 5 inches in length and is applied through powerful forward kicking strikes capable of lacerating organs and fracturing bone in a single contact. A cassowary does not build toward an attack the way many large animals do. It delivers one immediately, without graduated warning. The bird at this zoo had been displaying heightened territorial behavior during breeding season for weeks before the fundraiser, charging through fencing at handlers on multiple occasions.
That's one of those warnings people tend to dismiss because the animal's a bird. I think if this had been a tiger or a lion, everyone would have paid closer attention.
Staff were aware of the behavioral state. The event proceeded as scheduled. Volunteers were moving the cassowary into a temporary holding pen beside the visitor food tents, when a secondary latch on the holding gate, accidentally left unsecured after feed buckets were carried through, became the entire mechanism of failure. Not a policy breakdown, not an equipment fault. One latch, one moment of inattention. The cassowary forced the gate open and moved directly into the crowd near the main walkway. Elena was knocked to the ground during the initial panic as visitors scattered between vendor tents and parked vehicles. The cassowary delivered multiple downward strikes with its inner claw before staff managed to corner the bird near a wooded fence line. The open layout of a public event made intervention slower and more chaotic than a controlled enclosure would have allowed. Elena was transported by emergency crews and died from her injuries after leaving the scene. The The zoo closed the following year not by regulatory order, but because it lost its insurance coverage following the investigation. What the case documents so precisely is a failure of proportionality in how danger is assessed. A small volunteer fundraiser, a modest zoo, a bird most people couldn't identify on sight.
None of it registers as high risk until you understand what the animal was capable of, what behavioral state it was already in, and what a single unsecured latch meant in that context.
The next story is about a man who understood risk professionally, who brought a group of paying guests to a zoo that looked exactly like it was supposed to from the outside. What none of them could see was what the morning logs already knew. It was February 2nd, 2016, Eastern Tennessee. February in the foothills is unpredictable in the way of a season that hasn't committed to anything yet. Cold nights, mornings that feel almost warm, wind that changes direction without explanation. The zoo sat on a large parcel of rural land, accessible by a single gravel road, the kind of destination you found through word of mouth and a willingness to drive. No review page, no sign at the highway. Calvin Reddick organized things. At 38, the former construction foreman from Missouri had channeled years of logistics experience into running weekend bus tours to unusual roadside destinations across the Midwest. Outgoing and widely liked, he operated on the confidence of someone who had managed difficult variables for a long time and trusted his reads of new situations quickly. The zoo he brought his group to that February specialized in exotic and imported hoofed mammals. Its newest acquisition was a 4,500-pound southern white rhinoceros recently transferred through a private ranch exchange. White rhinoceroses are among the most misread large animals in captivity. Their familiar silhouette suggests something manageable, something people have seen on postcards and nature documentaries. That familiarity is the danger. They are capable of explosive charges covering ground faster than a sprinting adult, with enough force to overturn a light vehicle, and unlike most large grazers, they will turn, re-engage, and press past first contact. They do not redirect once committed. The animal at the zoo had been separated from another male during transport quarantine and arrived already in an elevated stress state. The staff were aware. The guided feeding session was scheduled as normal. Heavy winds had worked through the night on the animal's secondary holding gate, a barrier reinforced with a tow chain connected to a utility fence post after the primary gate developed structural issues. The chain had been in place for weeks, while repairs were delayed and funds directed elsewhere.
Whenever I see a temporary fix become a long-term solution, I already know where the investigation is probably heading.
Throughout the afternoon, the rhinoceros had been ramming the gate repeatedly from the inside. A sound staff at the gravel staging area could hear, but did not escalate into a halt of the ongoing tour. When the chain snapped, visitors were already positioned near the staging area. The initial movement confused people. For the first few seconds, several guests read it as part of the demonstration.
Which is actually understandable. People visit zoos expecting animals to be controlled. Their brains aren't prepared for the possibility that the demonstration has already failed.
That interval, the time it took the crowd to understand that what was moving toward them was not controlled, was when the situation became unrecoverable. Calvin moved towards several tourists, trying to redirect them to a loading platform. The rhinoceros crossed the gravel lot and struck him with enough force to drive him into a wooden railing. It did not redirect after first contact. Staff used a transport truck horn and emergency barriers to draw the animal away. It took longer than any account made it sound. Investigators found the zoo operating on expired permits with multiple documented containment failures across several enclosures. Nothing visible on arrival would have indicated otherwise. The permit had expired, the repairs had been deferred, and the animal had arrived in exactly the behavioral state that makes white rhinoceroses among the most unforgiving animals an underprepared facility can attempt to hold. Not because they are the largest, not because they are the fastest, because they do not stop. The thread running through every one of these stories is not recklessness, it is the specific confidence that comes from experience, from having been close to dangerous things before and walking away, from near misses that feel, over time, less like luck and more like skill. They are not the same thing. In the presence of an animal that does not negotiate, they are never the same thing.